Jerusalem continued to languish under Turkish rule. The city became tired, dirty, and its infrastructure was almost non-existent. Christians and Jews suffered under heavy prejudice. They weren't allowed to do some of the most basic things: ride horses, ring bells, repair their churches or synagogues. Once an intellectual capital, the city's cultural life began to disappear. By 1890, not a single operating printing press could be found in the old city. Ironically, during this time, the ideas that formed the modern nation of Israel were first introduced in Europe by a man who became the father of Zionism. Born in Budapest in 1860, Theodor Herzl was appalled by the anti-Semitism he witnessed as a correspondent covering the Dreyfus Affair in Paris in the late 1890s. He decided that the only solution to the problem would be the creation of a Jewish national state. An audacious bluffer, he went from nation to nation negotiating for a new homeland, but was turned down every time. He wrote and published The Jewish State in 1896, a how-to guide for national independence. Herzl also founded the World Zionist Congress in 1897 and served as its president until his death in 1904 at the age of 44. 13 years later, during World War I, Herzl's dream of a Jewish homeland would become reality as the British won control of Palestine from the Turks and lent a sympathetic ear to the calls of the Zionists. Following the 1917 Turkish surrender, a new group of rulers took over Jerusalem, the British. Prior to the surrender, several Allied nations had signed a secret agreement to make Palestine an Arab state, with control of the region split between Britain and France. As part of the agreement, the British ended up with Jerusalem. The next 32 years posed numerous problems between both the British and the Jewish people. During the short British reign, the old city began a program of restoration. The railway line to the Jaffa harbor was repaired. Holy sites were refurbished, and new museums, hotels, and hospitals were opened. Buildings sprang up all over the city. The British showed an interest in keeping and maintaining the ancient character of the old city. British Governor Sir Ronald Storrs even decreed that any new structures built must use the local pink and beige stone that was so prevalent in the older sites around Jerusalem. Religious pilgrims, especially Jewish ones, could now freely come and go. And they began coming in record numbers. However, many who came were more than just visitors. Following World War II, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust wanted to return to their homes in Eastern Europe. They were shocked to discover that they were still unwelcome. From August 1945 to May 1946, 64 ships left Europe, bringing 73,000 refugees to Palestine, who intended to settle in the homeland of their ancestors. They were aided by the underground Jewish army, the Haganah. But the British clung to their 1939 immigration limits because of Arab pressure. British forces turned back overcrowded ships or put illegal refugees into overcrowded internment camps. As an act of rebellion against the British, the Haganah proceeded to blow up 9 key bridges in Palestine in one night. On July 22, 1946, an entire wing of Jerusalem's beautiful King David Hotel exploded and collapsed. The bombing killed 91 people. The Irgun, a terrorist organization led by the late Menachem Begin, claimed responsibility. The ongoing tensions and loss of life was too much, and the British people began calling for withdrawal. In February 1947, Great Britain's cabinet decided to let the United Nations resolve the Palestine problem. After 9 months of debating, the UN produced a plan to partition Palestine between a Jewish and an Arab state. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the plan. Even as Jews danced in the streets, Arab rioting erupted throughout Palestine. In the first 5 months of 1948, every isolated Jewish village was attacked. In less than 6 months, 6,000 Jewish soldiers and civilians were killed. On May 15, 1948, the British pulled out of Palestine, and the Jewish State of Israel was born. Nowhere are the scars of the 1948 War of Independence more apparent than at the incredible Zion Gate. The gate was one of the focal points in the heavy fighting that broke out following the British retreat. As soon as the British troops were out of sight, the various Arab and Jewish factions of the city began vying for control of strategic sites within the gates. Some of the lopsided battles did go a long way toward helping build the Jewish army's later reputation for toughness. In one brief battle in mid-May, a ragtag Jewish force under Colonel David Shatil briefly took control of the Zion Gate. But to get the gate, they had to nearly destroy it. The War of Independence lasted for 7 months. Israel was victorious, except in Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter of the Old City could not hold out against overwhelming opposition, and ultimately fell to Jordanian legionnaires. At first, the city sustained only minor damage, but after Jewish nationalists surrendered to the victorious Jordanians, real destruction began to occur. Arab militants looted synagogues, schools, and homes, then began dynamiting structures in the Jewish quarter. In the end, 27 synagogues were destroyed, including the historic Nachmanides synagogue that dated from 1267. For nearly 19 years, the area around the Zion Gate became a no-man's land between Israelis and the Jordanians. To wander into the area was to invite sniper fire from the Jordanian troops manning the ramparts of the old city wall. Concrete barriers were erected to protect pedestrians. Not until after the Six-Day War in 1967 could the Jewish people rebuild and restore the Jewish quarter. It is now one of the most modern and attractive parts of the old city. Even today, one of the first things a visitor to the Zion Gate notices is the bullet holes that dot the wall around the old entryway. After gaining control of the old city, Jordan closed off the Jewish quarter and denied access to the Jewish holy sites, including the Western Wall. Unable to pray at the Holy Wall, Israelis found that the only place where they could catch a glimpse of the sacred wall was Mount Zion, just outside the Zion Gate. Following the 1948 War of Independence, the next major battle came in 1967, a sudden and violent upheaval called the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War began on June 5th, when the Israelis became concerned about an Egyptian naval blockade in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Under the Jewish commander Moshe Dayan, Israeli forces liberated Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the West Bank and the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, the Jewish army struck Jordanian positions in the Old City, attacking through the Lion's Gate. There was fierce house-to-house fighting in the tiny alleyways and twisting streets of the Old City. But within hours, Jerusalem was under Jewish control. For the first time in thousands of years, the Jewish nation possessed the Western Wall and the other holy sites. The years to follow have been eventful and often bloody in the Old City, but the Jewish faithful still pray freely at the Western Wall. Muslims still control the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. And Christian pilgrims still openly trace Christ's footsteps around the 14 stations of the cross.
A little bit of a biography of you. Get yourself into the Middle East.
Well, I'm from here.
You are from here?
Yes. born here, born in Haifa. My parents are Arabs, the Palestinians. Well, my father's Palestinian, my mother was Egyptian of Syrian background. And my father went to school here in Jerusalem at something called then Bishop Gilbert School, which is near Jaffa Gate. It exists now as a college of some kind, Wheaton, Red Wheaton. And then during the First World War, after the British came, he became an interpreter for the LMB administration prior to the establishment of the British Mandate.
LMB meaning?
General Allenby. He was the...
Oh, Allenby, okay, yeah, sure.
He's the one who liberated Jerusalem from the Turks. And then he became the interpreter to the Chief Justice, from which point he went to law school, became clerk of the Chief Justice. From that he became a senior magistrate, and district court judge, and land court judge, and traveled all over the countryside here. And then he retired just towards the end of the war, 1945, 46. And he was then a lawyer. And we escaped getting killed at the King David Hotel in November of 1946. And
he was 13 then, in 1946.
And then we were in schools in Haifa, British schools, all British schools, became target of Israeli terror groups. At that time they weren't Israelis, they were the Irgun and the Stern gang, attacking British targets, so the schools were closed. So we had to go to Egypt in 1947, well, 48 actually, 47 over Christmas, that Christmas period. And then we continued schools in Egypt, and then this area became Israel and Palestine, the first Arab-Israeli war. We couldn't return to Haifa, so my father established they wouldn't let him return, established a law practice in Jerusalem in 1948, in East Jerusalem, and he stayed here till he died.
Wow, you covered a lot of the interesting ground. So what was your dad's take, because of working for General Allenby and translator, and then all of a sudden 1917, time period, Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, did he have a sense of whether at that time the British would...
Are we on tape?
Yeah, we're on tape, yeah.
Yeah.
The British presence here, I mean, because though he was born here, not a British subject per se.
Well, I mean, let's face it, the issues here were never Arab-Jew.
Right.
There wasn't Hitler. The Jewish community was very happy to live in Europe. There were pogroms in Russia, so some Jews escaped from Russia and came here.
Right.
But generally speaking, people of Jewish faith preferred to live in the West, or wherever they lived, in the Arab countries or wherever. They're quite content, because this whole area was once upon a time Syria.
Right.
Jerusalem always had a special status on the Turks, but the rest of it was really basically Syria, which included what is now Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Really all Syria. And there was no ill feelings towards anybody of Jewish faith. They were considered part of the land. I mean, fellow travelers, fellow community members, if you will.
Right.
So the Balfour Declaration did not really bother too many people at the time, because we'd been under Turkish rule, and the British came and liberated us. We're part of the liberation. We joined with the under Lawrence of Arabia with the British to remove the Turkish yoke. The Turks were not very good rulers. They were very harsh. And so we were grateful to get rid of them, and the British got rid of them. But we didn't know what happened was that one thing would lead to another. The Versailles treaties divided this whole area into different colonial concerns and interest mandates, if you will. And a national home, Jews were living here. I mean, they were a small minority, but they were living here.
Right.
Now, a lot of people say that Jerusalem had a significant Jewish community. Yes, it did, but that's the old Jerusalem, not the Jerusalem as it became. Because all around Jerusalem were Arab villages who came into the city. So the Arab villages, which are all around here, are really part of what is known now, well, not now, it became part of Jerusalem under the British.
Right.
So, in a sense, there was no anti-feelings towards those of Jewish faith. They've lived in Arab society for almost forever. And so my father's feeling was the British were here to help, rather than to be the means of, in a sense, displacement of a large group of people who lived here forever, you know, from the beginning of time, if you will. We've had, you know, the Romans, and then we've had the Persians, then we've had the Arabs. So in other words, you know, Palestinians have been here and continued in their relationship to the soil. And of course, we became Arabized. It was natural. Some of us most probably came in from Arabia with the tribes, because there were Christian tribes in Arabia during the time of Islam. When Islam came into being, there were Christian tribes as well as Jewish tribes, and they were considered Arabs, obviously.
Sure.
So they, and after all, Abraham came from what is now Iraq. So there wasn't that sense of tension, no. And of course, nobody ever knew that what would happen in Nazi Germany, that in fact would focus on destruction of those of Jewish faith. And in fact, in my home, we had Jewish refugees who my father was happy to let them stay in our home for a short period of time. We had room, we're happy to have them. Our architect for our home, Goetzel, was a German refugee of Jewish faith, and we employed him to build our beautiful home in Haifa, which is sort of like a little mansion. In my classes at school were those of Jewish faith. So it wasn't, as you were growing up in the early 30s, there were some problems between those who came and took over Waqf land. Waqf land is land which is entrusted to the community through religious. Islam has something called the Waqfs. And the Waqfs are, if you will, trusts. And these trusts are sort of like homesteads. You can utilize them and use them, you know, but they remain Waqf lands. And it's usually controlled by the government that's in power. Well, obviously, the Turks were of Islamic faith, and so they weren't going to do anything with the Waqfs. But when the British took over, they became in control of the Waqfs, if you will. And so some of the lands were either given or sold, or Jewish settlers bought them, and some of them were bought. Some of them were just given by the British High Commissioner. The Jewish Agency, which was established under Herzl, I suppose, and developed later on into a major power. In every British embassy there was a Jewish agency, or under British protection, if you will, to encourage Jewish immigration. And that was all right. It wasn't until the Nazis started taking over Germany that such a large number of Jews started coming here to escape. We didn't know what was happening in Germany at the time. I mean, there was on the radio. Not much was said. I mean, the Olympics were held there. So these people were fleeing and coming here, and in a sense, the Arab community welcomed them. It's only in those areas where there were tensions, like Hebron, which often dealt with things like Abraham's tomb, or related to such issues like that, but they were very minor. I mean, people did get killed, but compared to other situations in the world, you would call, when anybody gets killed, it's never minor, but it wasn't a major confrontation between Arab society and those of Jewish faith. So, as the Jewish community began to flee Europe for fear, and they either went to America or Some of them fled to France, and of course as France became increasingly susceptible to possibility of a Second World War, they came here, that the Arab community began to say, now wait a minute, you know, we can't take all of that. Our lands are being taken over. Of course, the Balfour Declaration encouraged establishment of Jewish home. The British government was committed towards that, and obviously if there was land available and the settlers would buy it, or they were called colonies in those days. If those who came to colonize, if you will, and establish Jewish colonies, that they would indeed be given that or they'd buy it.
Right.
But quite often it was natural grazing land for the shepherds and others, or lands that were still for the walks. So it began to cause some tensions.
Right.
And the Arabs revolted against the Brits. And that lasted until just before the Second World War, which point the British declared the White Paper.
Just going to ask about that. Yeah, tell me about the White Paper.
And so the White Paper was to still provide for Jewish immigration, but in numbers that could be assimilated.
So it was a quota system.
Yeah, it was a quota system. A number of Jewish refugees would come on an annual basis. But with what was happening in Europe, and with the Nazis really after the Olympics beginning to bare their teeth with their barbarous methods in relationship to the Jewish community, or anybody who didn't agree with them, but most of the Jewish community. And of course they're not happy with the Jewish community because the scientists who were of Jewish background, if you will, some of them, had found the antidote to the gas of the Second World War that was killing so many people. So in a sense, there was a graduation of tension as a result of circumstances in Europe. So for me, living in Haifa, going to an Anglican school, my father being a judge and a lawyer eventually, and with a considerable amount of property that we had, there was never an issue about somebody being Jewish,
right,
or somebody being Muslim. We were sort of Palestinians. We saw ourselves as Palestinians under British rule. And many of us actually saw ourselves as British,
right,
in terms of nationality. I remember with a friend of mine who was of Jewish faith, we would sing God Save the King, because that was what we'd sing at school. So we would sing it together, and Mark and I used to do that all the time. And so our relationships with the Jewish community perhaps were not as close as it would be with the Arab Muslim community, because Muslims are Arabs.
right.
Now, while the Jews who lived in the Holy Land prior to the British coming themselves were also Arabs and spoke Arabic, but there were some colonists who had come as a result of the pogroms that were occurring in Russia. Clearly, we saw them as fellow countrymen. I mean, that's the way I felt about it. And my father was the judge of the land courts for a while, and he would judge cases relating to issues of land. In fact, one of the lawyers in Nazareth told me that in the law school, they used my father's decisions on some land cases as part of the teaching at the law school in Haifa.
Okay.
But I just found that out, by
Yeah.
the way, about the last few months that I've been here, that this was the case, that his rulings were of such clarity. Well, when the Jewish settlers had bought the land legally, sometimes from Syrians, because after the division of this area into different countries, Syrians couldn't just come to Palestine. They were under French rule, you had to cross the border to come here, there were requirements in terms of cross-border things. Some of the Syrians and Lebanese just sold what lands they had here, which would be sort of natural, because you couldn't sort of cross over.
Right.
Sort of like suddenly finding yourself living in Canada, what was the United States, or Mexico, or whatever, that there wasn't the freedom of movement that they used to have. There was movement, but it wasn't like this was the same country.
Yeah.
So some Syrians and Lebanese did sell some of their lands to legitimately Jewish settlers. And when they did buy them legitimately, my father rooted for those settlers, or colonies, as we used to call them. Settlers is a different word. I mean, settlers can only be used when you're dealing with today with occupation here, where there are settlements being built on Arab land, sort of like expansion, like you used to see settlers in the States, but that's not the case. The settlers are occupied Arab land. Those persons who were colonies were Jewish colonies buying land, and that was all right. But when these colonies started taking lands which were hereditary under the Waqf, it caused tensions.
Right. Oh, interesting.
So my father withdrew then, of course, against the colonies if they took land which was Waqf land or related to Waqf land or obtained illegally or whatever. So actually we ended up having to live in Lebanon for 2 years.
No kidding. Was there a fear, I mean, just a real fear factor?
Well, I mean, my father was a judge and he was ruling for both. He was being an honest judge, so he just took leave of absence and we ended up in Lebanon, in Beirut, for some time. Then we came back, it wasn't very long, I think it was maybe 18 months or so. We still had our home here, so we went to school there. And then, of course, we came back. And then, of course, the Second World War started. And then, of course, the reality of Jewish immigration became much, much larger due to the fact that Europe collapsed under the horrors of the Nazis and the Holocaust that occurred. But the Palestinians knew very little of that. Now, remember that the Palestinians, or the Arabs, sided with the British against the Germans and the Turks.
Right.
So if you're feeling that your new master is betraying you, you'd obviously go to the other side, right? So you'd go towards the Germans. But the Germans, when they were here at Beth Haifa, were normal people, if you will. Nobody ever thought that these civilized people, called the Germans, would do the horrible things that they were doing. We'd heard a little bit of the pogroms in Russia against the Jewish community. But and of course the Jewish community sided with the Bolsheviks to get rid of those aspects. But as far as the Western Europeans, I mean, nobody ever thought that Germans, so the stories that people heard, they couldn't believe them.
Right.
They didn't, well, it wasn't real for them. As I said, the Olympics had just been held there and the whole world listened on radio and everything else. Some of these people are criminals. Well, I mean, it was hard to comprehend that. But the reality was they were. There's no question about that. Hitler's final solution and Himmler's were horror, barbaric. But the Palestinians knew very little. All of a sudden they found this onslaught of people coming in. This is a small land. So you had to make room for them. So at the end of the war, the British came out weak from the war. Clearly, they suddenly were being attacked by the people they'd saved from the Holocaust.
Right.
British soldiers were attacked by the Irgun and the Stern Gang. Stations were being blown up, people were being killed. Kind of a thing that we.
And the principal reason was that the European Jews were trying to find their way back, to Israel, and
because they had nowhere else to go.
No place else to go, and the British still had this white paper.
Yes.
Still restricted by that.
Restricted by that, of course, because they made the promise to the Arabs.
Right.
And the white paper, under normal circumstances, would have been all right, because it was a gradual assimilation of the Jewish community into Palestine. But large numbers fleeing the horrors of Germany,
right,
and eventually France and Italy, which were occupied, and all of Europe. And then at the end of the war, as places were liberated, the DPs, the displaced persons, trying to seek and find a new home, and obviously Palestine, with Jewish agency being in a variety of places, this would be, for the Jewish community, was obviously a natural place to come to.
Right.
But in so doing, you're displacing Palestinians. And eventually, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
You had a situation where, even there have been a lot of plans because of the tensions here, in relationship what to do with Palestine. The British had several plans. There was a series of plans, series of people who came to review what to do about this. How do you fulfill the Balfour Declaration without violating the Palestinians' rights? How do you fulfill that? There were all sorts of plans, all sorts of discussions, but the eventual reality was that the British let the United Nations make that decision. They decided to, in 1947, November, almost a year after the attack on the headquarters of the British government in Jerusalem, King David Hotel, which I just survived by a few minutes.
Talk about that a little bit, because if you watch the movie of which was popular, Exodus,
yes,
very much that was the tension time period. That 46, 47, Cyprus coming over here, and you were caught up in that.
Yes,
You and your dad. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, my father had come to Jerusalem, he's retired from the government, and some of the people he'd worked with were now finishing their tour of duty in Palestine and were returning back to Britain. So he was here in Jerusalem to say goodbye to them, and at the same time he had some legal, he'd become a lawyer at that point with nice law practice, but he still had a lot of friends in the government.
Sure.
He'd been in the government since 1917 almost, and this is now 1945, 46, 47. So he remained a judge through all the Arab revolt against the British, and so clearly we had come to Jerusalem, and then around noon I got hungry. Well, actually I didn't get hungry. YMCA was next door. King David YMCA, there's a small road between them. And a friend of mine was swimming there.
Yeah.
A charming young woman, actually. And I thought it'd be very nice to go and see them practice.
Sure.
Well, I was also hungry.
Yeah.
We left very early, early in the morning, driven up here in our car. At that time, it was a Chevrolet, and we got here, and so I got my father to move across. My brother was at the school here in Jerusalem also, so we got to see my brother in boarding school, typical British boarding school, Bishop Gogat School in Jerusalem. So I got Daddy to go to get a bite of. We were staying at the Y. It's beautiful. It's international Y. It's like a regular hotel. To have lunch there. So we walked out and walked up the steps just across the street. We're on the second set of steps when the whole thing blew up. People we'd just been to see never made it out. So it was an astonishing reality of life and death. I experienced a little bit of that when we had one bombing. Well, I experienced a bit of that bombing when the Jewish terrorists, then the Stern Gang, had blown up the British police station close to my father's law offices, and we knew a lot of the police and that, whom I'd known, that he would go there for a variety of things, and were killed. And that was a shocker to me. This was another major shocker. I had, during the Second World War, a German aircraft had got shot down, so we'd been bombed for just a little bit during 1941-42, when the Germans were in Libya, if you will, and just before the Battle of Alamein. So, but the King David Hotel was something that would live in my memory.
Samir, talk about that plane that was shot down by your house.
Oh, well, that's all right. The British always treated the prisoners of war very nicely and offered them tea.
You gotta love the British.
He is the guy who was trying to kill us and, and bomb us. We were in a British zone.
Yeah.
Or where we lived was on top of Mount Carmel, which is a British zone. They had the anti-aircraft guns there governing because Haifa became the major port because Alexandria was threatened by the possibility of Rommel sweeping across.
Right.
They closed all the other ports, so Haifa became the major port. Beirut was in Vichy, France, to the north. The British eventually occupied Lebanon and Syria. In the meantime, the British had been establishing we've had already the Arab Legion, which was Transjordanian, and they were under British training, if you will. But the British established the Jewish Brigade. And I got to meet a lot of these officers of the Jewish Brigade, because my father would visit the various colonies as part of his job as a judge during the war. And they so established a Jewish Brigade, which really became the Haganah, which really became the Israeli army,
right.
to which were integrated elements of the Irgun and the Stern Gang into the Haganah or the Palmach, which was really the British Brigade, trained by Lord Wingate, who also helped train the British commandos in Malaysia against the communists. And Wingate himself, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, was of Jewish faith, but it didn't matter. Nobody ever asked what people's religious convictions were. I mean, we were all together, if you will, into this milieu, and in a sense, a time of innocency,
right.
where we thought of ourselves as Palestinians who were British. We didn't think of Jews as being Jews. We thought of them as being Palestinians who were of Jewish faith. The Muslims were of Muslim faith. We spoke Arabic. Many of the Jews spoke perfect Arabic. The European Jews, of course, came as a whole different kettle of fish. They, of course, spoke German or they spoke French, and they had to be integrated into the system of schools as such. But the British had allowed, during the Arab revolt, which started in 1936-37 against the British, allowed the Jewish settlement colonies, as we call them, to be armed, while the Palestinian police, which were in Arab areas, was not armed. The Arab Palestinians were disarmed. There were also a lot of Arab officers in the British Army. Recruited them, like recruited Indians and others in the British Army. And most of those ended up being with the Arab Legion. But the Jewish Brigade really was a very major force. And at the end of the war, when it was disbanded, really didn't get disbanded, became the unofficial militia of the an exodus. Sort of very funny about all that. Of course, it was a movie and a book, and trying to capture what happened in that period of time. But the British had also built something called the Eden Line. And I remember going with my dad visiting these colonies and seeing these structures underground, known as the Eden Line. So in case the Germans broke in from Egypt, or they broke in from the French before they neutralized Syria and Lebanon, which were under Vichy French, they were French under the mandates, right. That the Jewish community were able to defend itself, because obviously by that time it became clear, at least to the British, what was happening in Germany and the horrors of the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism and all that took place. So the Jewish community was not unprepared. In the meantime, they had a para-government called the Jewish Agency. And the para-government, the Jewish Agency, managed immigration, managed Jewish affairs, in effect was a government in a government, functioning really parallel track to the regular British mandate when it affected Jewish affairs. Palestinians didn't have any of that. Right. They had the Arab High Committee, which really was nothing after the revolt ended, if you will, and Hajj Amin Husseini fled off to Germany, and many of us thought that he perhaps was working for the Allies, because he turned back into Egypt, which was under the control of the British. So if he really was a war criminal, why wasn't he then picked up and into Nuremberg, among others, and tried, speaking of Nuremberg trials. Yeah. So clearly he must have been part of the people inside Germany who were helpful to the Allied cause. I don't know that for a fact, but the point of the matter is he reappeared in an area controlled by the British after the Second World War, which would be odd if he had been a true war criminal. So they would have picked him up and prosecuted him. But nevertheless, none of us were related to Hajj Amin Husseini per se. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and the spiritual leader, but Palestinians didn't have any military force, and were very innocent, if you will, in many ways quite innocent. Never thought the British would leave Palestine.
Was that a shock when you...
It was a shock.
Yeah.
It was more than a shock. Palestine became almost like a British colony. Yeah, they had the British High Commissioner. Everything was run on British lines. In other words, it didn't appear as a mandate per se that the British here on a temporary basis. It was really run like a colony. You had the cream of British civil servants serving here, of the aristocracy, and they acted that way. So the judicial system and all aspects of that. But you could begin to see that something was happening, but you couldn't quite put your fingers on it. And so I remember spending the night listening to the decisions of the United Nations over the radio when the United Nations voted to separate Palestine into 2 states and into a corpus separatum. What I couldn't understand as I heard it is how you're going to put up a Jewish state in a majority area which were Arabs. The way the state was structured, it would have included some major Arab concentrations in the north. Somehow it didn't make sense to me at all. I remember asking my father, how is the state going to come to be? And my father was still a believer, not only because he was an Anglican, and therefore we became Anglicans long before the British came. Right. We became Anglicans in the 1850s. So, but still, we thought of them as fellow parishioners, if you will, fellow countrymen in the sense spiritually. He never felt the British would do something as crazy as he felt they did. And said, well, the British are here to make sure everybody's protected. They had a huge number of troops here, 250,000 to 500,000 troops. I've got how much they had. But a lot of troops, because this was a major base for the British, and the Suez Canal was right next door. So, then of course the Labour government came into being after the war. Right. Now there's no question where...
This is Attlee, right?
Yeah, and particularly Lord Bevan, his foreign minister. There's no question in my mind that Churchill believed in Zionism from a religious point of view, that there's nothing wrong with persons of Jewish faith returning to Zion. And had he been in power, Churchill was wise enough to recognize that you have to deal with the Arabs. And therefore, if you're going to establish a Jewish state, then you have to be at peace with the Arabs to do so. And what he then made sure the state came into being. Sort of just what the British did as they did in India. They just walked out. And you've got Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And so the sad thing was that with the Arabs having nobody to protect them, Palestinian population, the Jewish terrorist groups, which was not the Haganah. Now the Haganah protected people in the north. That's why you still have Arab towns there. Of course, also because there were Druze. Anywhere where there were Arabs who were of Druze faith, things went well, because the Druze always supported whoever is in power. So in the north, in Galilee, there's a large number of villages, towns, there are Druze. But in other areas where there had been there were massacres. There were by the Irgun. One of them is just outside of Jerusalem. So all of that had an impact. In the meantime, we're in school in Cairo. Yeah. My parents are commuting back to Haifa, back and forth. They're doing his law work, coming to Jerusalem. All sorts of tensions involved in terms of the British withdrawal, very disorderly withdrawal, I would think. Actually, as time went on, the British trucks would actually, they were going to British bases to bring troops, would actually take Palestinians out. You can see pictures of Palestinians on British trucks leaving, running off to Lebanon.
No kidding. No.
There's some very interesting pictures of that. People were on the road, so they gave them rides. There was a whole disorderly aspect to that. So before the mandate ended...
by the way, did you know when that was going to actually occur? Yes. UN resolution was...
May the 15th was when it was...
Okay.
The British British made that they would leave on May the 15th.
Okay, and how far in advance did they tell you that? The UN passed its resolution end of
1947. They declared it around that time.
Okay, so they said 6 months and we're out of here.
After running country since 1917,
Yeah.
to walk out in
6 months, yeah.
Was, of course, the reality is that they already knew that on the Jewish side there was actually government functioning, and which it was, obviously, because they declared independence, and there had been Jewish agents who was the government, and so Ben Gurion headed that, so they were able to declare a state. The Palestinian Arabs were totally disorganized. And you see, the important thing is Palestinian Arabs never declared war on anybody. How could they? They didn't have a government. Now, they had a few fighters who had been trained either under the British or whatever, the paramilitary, and they, as soon as the British started withdrawing, they were trying to protect some of the Arab villages because the Israelis occupied some of those Arab towns before the British left. And when the Arab armies, which had not recognized the state of Israel to be a state, came in, they actually never set foot in what was to be Israel, technically.
Yeah.
They may have strayed over a mile or two in the desert or something, but they never actually, they actually came into Arab areas, which had already, a good portion of which had become occupied by the Haganah or Israeli paramilitary forces. It became the Israeli army. Now, certainly in numbers, the Arabs were by far more, when you're talking about Arab armies, but if you recall, those Arab armies were all under colonial rulers the British had installed.
Right.
So they weren't really Arab armies, they were para-Arab armies, they were, in a sense. And actually, as a result of the fiasco of 1948, the entire colonial system the British set up and the French collapsed, because those officers then overthrew the governments. That's what had been set up by the Brits. Actually, Palestine is the reason why. King Farouk lost his throne eventually, the King of Libya lost his throne eventually, Syria and Lebanon became disordered. Syria eventually was, from a regular government, became a military coup. The same thing happened in Iraq when the king was overthrown. So the result of the fiasco that the British had done in Palestine and the inability of the Arab armies, which were really wholly discoordinated, but largely operating really under British and French mentorship, if you will. And of course, the Israelis would become a state. Many of them had come from having survived the Holocaust, had no intention of finding themselves in another situation that they'd been in Europe. And the consequence of which the Palestinian Arabs suffered.
Right.
And we know that they physically moved people out of Jaffa and led them Ramleh to clear up that area up to Ramallah. I mean, they walked them out. People were eating dinners, etc., told them had to leave. So that's becoming more and more reality. Israelis are willing to admit that during this very difficult period of time, they felt that their backs were against the wall, they did everything in power to establish the Jewish state, and really they accepted the United Nations resolution because that's the only option they had. But clearly, what was to be an Arab state would, if it was a democratic state, would have voted an Arab government in a Jewish state.
Sure.
Because there were a majority in those areas. So, I mean, some places remained in the north, particularly Nazareth. Some of the Druze and Christian areas more or less survived. Haifa, which was a very large Arab Jewish town, today still has about 22% of the population, even today, is Arab. That's an excellent town that shows how Arabs and those, because Haifa was always a place where Arab and Jews lived very nicely with each other. They were integrated. They weren't like Tel Aviv and Jaffa. Jaffa was Arab, Tel Aviv was Jewish. Haifa was an integrated town. It was a port city and it was an integrated town. But other places weren't that way at all. So, in consequence to all of that, the Palestinians became dispossessed. And efforts were made by Khan Folk Ben Adad about Jerusalem to be Caucasus. As you know, under the UN resolution, Jerusalem, Bethlehem was to be corpus separatum, an international area, basically under the United Nations. But obviously, neither side would think of it in those terms. Right. And actually, the Jewish community almost lost Jerusalem, except for the intercessions of the West, which allowed food and equipment to come in, instead of which...
This was when the Jordanians had them?
They were surrounded, totally surrounded. Yeah. And, but, I mean, the Jewish community is pretty highly trained. Many of them serve in military forces of the West, so they're able to smuggle in a lot of arms during the times when they had these truces. And eventually ended up with West Jerusalem, in effect surrounded by Arab territory, and remained in a sense that way until the 6-7 war. Right. If you look at the map very clearly, and what is now going down to the airport, that road was totally closed. And that's where the Jordan army gave the Israelis a real licking at where the Jews, where they really stood and fought. This is why you've got the West Bank almost right to the airport. Right. I mean, it's right out there. There's a lot of questions of what happened to the Iraqi army that was in Petah Tikva, why it withdrew and allowed the Israeli forces to come and hit the Egyptian flank, which didn't know thought it was the Iraqis coming, instead of which turned out to be the Israelis. Right. Why would they withdrew? Supposedly withdrew to come to the help of the Jordanian or Arab Legion, which really didn't need much help. Right. But then Jenin, Tulkarm, etc., that whole area in the north was Arab, part of the Arab state, but the Iraqis were there as to why they withdrew and allowed, therefore, they were in a position to cut what was to be the Jewish state in half, right. Really. But they were ordered to withdraw because they had British officers. Both the Arab Legion, all of them had British officers, or were under mentorship of that kind. So the Egyptians ended up in a place called Fallujah, which is down near Beersheba. Were surrounded. They refused to surrender. They didn't have any water where it lasted. That's where Gamal Abdel Nasser and Sadat came into being, feeling eventually they overthrew the king, but they did it nicely. Unlike what they did in Iraq and other places, they let them leave on a ship with honors pertaining thereto, which was not the case elsewhere. So also, obviously, as the British left these areas, clearly an establishment state of Israel, suffering the Palestinians, Arab countries, which had had Jewish communities, the Jewish community in those countries began to feel the pressure. But the biggest immigration that came out of Egypt was when they nationalized. So and the Jewish community was quite wealthy in Egypt. Yeah. And when it was nationalized, a lot of the Jews just simply left. Some of them came here, others went to Europe. In Iraq, after the revolution and the overthrow of the king, again the Jewish community was faced with the realities of life, that there's a Jewish state, and the Jewish state had in effect taken over. This was by now, they were talking about the 50s. They had thrown out the Palestinians, so the Iraqi military force that took over wasn't as gracious as the Egyptians were in relationship to letting the Jews leave if they wanted to, but mostly under nationalization of the properties. Right. My uncle, which held a lot of properties in Egypt, had all of the land. He could only keep 200 acres. Everything else was taken over because it was a socialist revolution. Just
curious, when they talk about nationalizing, do they pay them for the property they take over?
They do pay, but it's not very much.
Yeah, sort of like an eminent domain, but not the same.
Not very much. But you see, by so doing, the Arabs lost Arabs of Jewish faith, who were basically, along with Christians, who were the cream of the crop. Yeah. Well educated, well motivated, quite successful. And some of them came to Israel, but the largest number of them went westwise. They knew that in the long term they're going to have a problem. There's still a large Jewish community in Morocco, I mean, there was until the overthrow of the Shah, and since the Persians aren't Arabs, large Jewish community in Iran, right next to Iraq. The Jewish community has really prospered under Islam, always has. And Islam always treated them reasonably well, treated them as well as Christians.
Sure.
So the trauma of what this has happened is in the psyche of the Palestinian. And if you look at the map, you see this whole region's huge, and there's this little place called Palestine, and people say, well, they're Arabs, why couldn't they, like Americans do, leave from California and go to Texas, or leave from Massachusetts, go down to the south and live? And they don't understand that there's a real sense of a tie with the land. Palestinians had survived whoever came here, and they stayed with the land, because as far as the Bible is concerned, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans and the Allied community was established, they just destroyed the city.
Right.
They didn't destroy all the villages. So these villages remained here when the Persians came, then the Arabs came, and with the Arabs possibly came a large number of Jewish and Christian Arabs from Arabia, the tribes that were there. So in the psyche of the West, given the anti-Semitism, given the misunderstanding of the biblical promise, for after all, the biblical promise is complete in Jesus Christ.
Right.
There's no Jew or Gentile, there's no bond or free, there's no male or female, we're told in the Galatians, but we're all heirs to Abraham's seed.
Right.
So we are the children of the promise. So in a sense, the promise is fulfilled in Christianity. But it doesn't mean that the people of the Old Testament are to be persecuted.
Right.
That's the tragedy of Christianity, that anti-Semitism was quite ripe within the Christian society rather than the Islamic society. The anti-Semitism under the Tsar, when we have that wonderful musical Fiddler on the Roof.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even my donkey God, you know,
Yeah.
Why me kind of thing. The anti-Semitism that was inherent within, if you will, Western Christianity. Not only was it inherent within Western Christianity, in that sense of the word, it was only after Spain became Roman Catholic, after 500 years of rule of Muslims, still remained Christian, mind you. I mean, the Arabs lived there for 500 years.
Sure.
And when they left, or when the Moors left, if you will, were still Christian. And that's when the Jewish community faced persecution, and synagogues were made into churches, as were mosques.
Mm-hmm.
So the virulent anti-Semitism, which is misunderstanding what happened with the crucifixion of our Lord, because after all, Palestine was under the control of the Romans. Pilate allowed him to be crucified. And the leadership of the Jewish community then were like Vichy France, really weren't leaders of the Jewish community.
Sure.
Because they had revolted against, and most of these leaders had been executed. So you had, in a sense, a colonial government. So the feeling that it was the Jewish community that executed Christ is nonsense. That virulent anti-Semitism that lived within the life of the Western Christian Church has a lot to do with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
But certainly was not part of the Arab society or Islamic society or the Eastern society. So when the Crusades came, not only did they take over Islamic institutions, they took over Eastern Orthodox churches, whether it was in Constantinople or here, because they were in schism with Rome. So all of that is still in the history of the people here,
Right.
their experience. And in spite of that, the Christian community still continues here, small as it is.
Right.
But there was a time in the 4th and 5th century when the entire country was Christian. There was a time, as the British left, when out of the whole population of Palestine, that everybody, 25% were Christian. Of course, some of them were Armenians, some of them were Syrian, but they were Christians. They mostly would say the largest part were Arabs. So 1 out of every 4, whether Jew or Arab, was a Christian. Today it's 1.5%, under 2%. So it's sort of sad really that the historic Christian community that has survived, as a result of all that, has been decimated. And what the church is trying to do is rebuild the Christian community, because the Christian community has always been the moderating balance, the dialogue between two other faiths, of which Christianity has a great relationship with, by virtue of the fact that, of course, in terms of Judaism, you've got the Old Testament; in terms of Islam, you've got a large part of the Old Testament and a portion of the New Testament. That Christ was born of the Virgin Mary; she was a virgin. So, Christianity was always sort of the moderating balance, the catalyst that brought people together. But with the Christian community being decimated throughout the Middle East, beginning with the Arab-Israeli War and since, that balance is not here anymore.
That's interesting. Whether your dad ever thought, ever did a second guess as to what the British could have done differently?
Yes, he did. He thought the British could have, he believed in the British, as many Palestinians believe in the British. I mean, why wouldn't we not believe in the British? Sure. I mean, but he always felt that they would stand by and fulfill their promises, because he saw Britain as a Christian nation that lived in accordance with certain precepts, and he was a great admirer of British law and obviously trained that way.
Sure.
So from his perspective, had the Conservative government remained in power in Britain, there would not have been a disorderly withdrawal, not only in Palestine, that same disorderly withdrawal out of India, where thousands and thousands died in that. There was this total, let's give up, you know, they just gave up. Churchill would never have done that.
Right.
So my father was always a conservative. He was never a socialist. He was always a free market person, and he believed in that. And that Churchill would have, he always said that he believed that, even though certainly there was no question in anybody's mind that Churchill would see a Jewish state into being, but Churchill would have seen to it the Arab state also existed, because my father felt that for the Jewish state to exist in the Middle East, it can't be just an island on its own, it has to be part of the Jewish, of the Arab world. In other words, that the Jewish state would have to learn to live with Islam, which would be the overwhelming majority surrounding it. It just can't be an island. There's no way it can survive that way in the long term.
Right.
So he always felt that the British would make sure that there was an Arab state in place, which then would help the Palestinian state, being with a large Christian presence and British trained, would have then helped the Islamic world to know how to live with Judaism, or Judaism to learn how to live with Islam. Right. Geopolitically. So he was deeply disappointed by the way things happened. It broke his heart, actually. And he thought someday the British will correct it.
Not yet.
To his dying day, he thought that they would do something to correct it. They felt the Jordanians, which were the Hashemites, which were the original overthrow the Turks, would someday be the means whereby the Palestinians' rights and privileges would be restored in some kind of a confederated state with Jordan. A Palestinian state, but in confederation with Jordan. And he also was a strong believer that the Arabs should have accepted the concept of the first Camp David Accords. The concept that there is no purpose in war, but that you can accommodate and begin a process of accommodation. So if indeed they'd accepted the 67, I mean, not 67, had they accepted Camp David Accords in the 70s, you would have all these West Bank settlements today. So there would have been perhaps a viable Palestinian state. And they all felt that this Palestinian state could then be related naturally with Jordan. Now Gaza has always been sort of a different part of Palestine. It was always out there in the desert. And though when the Israelis pushed a number of people out of the area around Jaffa. Some went over to Gaza, but most of them came to here. But since Gaza became an Egyptian enclave, Egypt's form of government is quite different from Jordan, because Jordan's form of government is very much based upon British law. And if you travel around the West Bank and you see the Palestinian camps, refugee camps, they're basically cities, or in Jordan. If you travel to Gaza, they're really refugee camps. I mean, there's no proper sewage, there's no proper any of that. The Jordanians really treated all Palestinians as co-equal with them. The Egyptians never got down, settling down what they're going to do with the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip has always been, because of the way it ended being a strip, never has had the same kind of capacity in terms of self-governance and in terms of, I mean, to go to Cairo, you have a huge desert, which for a long time was occupied by the Israelis. Here, I mean, across the Jordan, you drive down the Jordan, you see Jordan. I mean, they're contiguous. So in a sense, they've been left out there, left field kind of a thing. And it's been very sad, because as a result of that, the Gazans have a whole different, I would think, the Palestinians and the rights needs to be protected, human rights, etc. There's a whole different dimension to them that have to be dealt with, which is different from the West Bank and Gaza. But Gaza is still Palestinian, and these are Palestinians. But until 67, from 48, they're under Egyptian rule. And often they have long been influenced by Egypt, because they're next to Egypt. Rafah is there. Yeah. I always thought of Gaza as a stop on the way to Cairo, on the train, before you crossed over into Egypt, at which point the train changed who was running it. At Rafah, which is right across the border, just this side of the border.
This has been great, and I've taken up a lot of your time, but
My pleasure.
This has been terrific.